Well, earlier this week, President Bola Tinubu declared a state of emergency on security. President Tinubu also asked citizens not to give in to fear, assuring that the fight against insecurity will be won. The question that is now on the lips of many is, when will the fight against insecurity be won? Tonight, Jide Ogunsanwo, who is the founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's chief data analyst, is here to share more facts and vital insight on Nigeria's state of emergency on security and what could come next. Thank you very much, Jide, for joining us on the News at 10.
Yeah, good evening, Anne.
Now, this isn't the first time a state of emergency will be declared on security. What makes this time different?
So you're right. This isn't the first time. It had first happened in 1962. Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa had declared a state of emergency based on what was happening in the action group. It again happened in 1967 under General Yakubu Gowon when we were about to go into a civil war. It again happened under President Jonathan in 2013. So yes, this isn't the first time. However, what makes this certainly different, especially if you remember how it was done when President Jonathan declared a state of emergency, there was a State of the Nation address. This time around, we see the president doing this online. Again, when President Jonathan declared that state of emergency in May 2013, he had before then declared state of emergencies at about 15 local governments before he went on to declare a state of emergency in Borno, Adamawa, Yobe. This time around, the president didn't do that. He declared a state of emergency straight at the national level. So we can clearly see difference. President Jonathan talked about, during that state of emergency address, that he was going to be doing a proclamation and sending some information to the National Assembly for concurrence. We didn't get that in this message from President Tinubu. So we clearly see differences. But again, let's look at our history. If we take a look at the timelines, right from the different types of state of emergencies, it allows us to understand that a state of emergency has been happening, especially in this Fourth Republic. Remember, under Obasanjo, Plateau, Ekiti, Jonathan, in December 2011, had declared the state of emergency across 15 local governments before that May 2013 nationwide address. President Buhari had also declared a state of emergency, but it wasn't on security. He declared a state of emergency on water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And from President Tinubu, we clearly remember what happened earlier this year in Rivers. But beyond this, there are some things that we should highlight as essential in President Jonathan's state of the emergency address, because three major things come out as strong points that are still relevant even till today, even though this is now a dozen years after that state of emergency was declared. And if we look at the highlights of President Jonathan's speech in declaring that state of message, 10 minutes nationwide address, some things come out clearly. He had made sure that the Chief of Defense Staff was directed to immediately deploy more troops to states. This time around, the president is ordering what should be done. The details of this proclamation will also be transmitted to the National Assembly in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. That was the President Jonathan's approach. The president this time around doesn't seem to be taking that approach. At least no mentions of that was seen in his message. But finally, one thing we should remember President Jonathan said, which we should remember, is that these terrorists and insurgents seem determined to establish control and authority over parts of our beloved nation and to progressively overwhelm the rest of the country. And this was in 2013, progressively to overwhelm the rest of the country. Now, what we've seen in the last dozen years is these statements coming to pass. We've seen a progression in this state of terrorist acts. One thing, however, that President Tinubu needs to also make sure is that his standard and the quality checks of his communication needs to be even more thorough. We look at the official message from President Tinubu in this letter that he talked about the state of emergency, and you can clearly see a repetition in two areas. The same paragraph, copy and paste, and this sort of low standards cannot and shouldn't be allowed from his handlers, whereby we see a repetition in a communication as important as a state of emergency address, where we're seeing a copy and paste, and that same communication goes out as the president's official message. So we need to really get the president to review the processes and the quality control over the messages that come out from his office.
But let's talk about beyond the domestic security concerns in Nigeria. I know many Nigerians are concerned about this, but what is the external perception of the security situation in Nigeria?
Now, there isn't really good news if we talk about the external perception. The Armed Conflict and Location Event Data Outlet makes it clear that Nigeria is currently among the top 10 countries in the world with the most fatalities. If you take a look at their data, there's some reasons to be worried. Yes, we are not number one. Number one on that list still is Ukraine. However, Nigeria is number 5 on the list of countries with the most fatalities this year in 2025. So we need to make sure that we get out of this list as soon as possible. The challenge with that list is 80% of global terrorism fatalities occur in these 10 countries in front of us. So the first responsibility which the armed forces and the security agencies say they're also doing is to make sure that the number of attacks and the casualties from these attacks significantly declines.
But another thing security agencies are doing is intensifying operations within, resulting in the security and securing the abducted and kidnapped victims and arresting some of the wanted terrorists. But from what you know and from what you have seen in the past, do you think that this momentum can be sustained?
Yes, this momentum can be sustained. And earlier this week as well, the Chief of Defense Staff, who is relatively new, General Olufemi Oluyede, has made it clear that among all the other states that will be emphasizing and intensifying security operations, Kwara and Kogi will be having special ground operations. You might ask, why Kwara and Kogi? And I think I'll take you into the data that also kind of justifies why Kwara and Kogi are states of special concern. Again, looking at the data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event data, they say that there are 10 states in Nigeria that account for 80% of all terrorism-related casualties. You heard me right. 10 states. These are the 10 states in front of you. These 10 states account for most of all the challenges we face. The real concern is, if you study the regions, you'll notice that prior to now, the Northeast was Nigeria's problem. From ACLED, they say there's only one state in the Northeast right now that's among these 10 states, and that's Borno. There are 4 states in the North Central, and there are 5 states in the Northwest. So the challenge we are facing is really what exactly is going on in the West. So the epicenter of terrorism right now has moved from Northeast Nigeria to West Nigeria. Again, why is Kwara and Kebbi states quite important? Yes, Kwara and Kebbi states are 2 states that are among these top 10. However, if you look at the numbers, last year, January to October, number of fatalities due to terrorism in Kwara State, 17. This year, January to October, 205. Over 1,000% increase. Same thing with Kebbi, from 25 to 169, over 500% increase. On a regional perspective, the numbers also are similar. The Northwest, 36% of all fatalities this year. The Northeast, 34%. The North Central, 21%. The challenge is Kwara and Kogi. And don't forget, Kogi State currently borders 10 states. So if we aren't able to quickly resolve the concerns in Kogi, 10 other states will be affected. All
right, quickly, Babajide, before we go, I know that some state governments, Oyo, Osun, Ogun, and Lagos, are already taking serious steps in tackling insecurity in their region, but that's on the state level. So when you look at what should be done from the government level, beyond the state of emergency, what other card can President Tinubu play?
President Tinubu can actually go for the other card of more military operations in the state, which is even intensifying, similar to what President Jonathan did, declaring a state of emergency at the state level, which means we'll see more military administration and more military operations within the states. We are not at that level yet, but it's a card that the president could play. Again, you talked about, that popular word, ICU, intensive care unit. We are currently not at the state, but the Chief of Defense Staff has also talked about ICU, but ICU in terms of initiative, courage, and understanding. And if you take a look at the remarks he made earlier this week as well, when all of this was going on, he's made it clear that this nation is only as strong as the initiative we show, the courage we carry, the understanding we build, and the loyalty we give. ICU. But above all, there are 2 things that we should take out tonight. The first is, don't forget, 80% of all terrorist attacks and fatalities currently occur in 10 states. And that is the Pareto principle. We need to focus on these 10 states and look at the trends that are going on within the local governments within the states. And
thank you very much. Jide Ogunsanwo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's chief data analyst. Thanks for your analysis on the news at 10.
Hopefully we'll do this again.
We will do it again.